Okay, welcome back to the Dissertation Writers Workshop asynchronous resource, where we're reviewing key ideas for making progress on your dissertation. This is part 3 of the resource. As a reminder, this resource is broken up into 4 different parts. There are 4 videos as well as a companion worksheet. We do recommend you engage with the resource in this order. In part 2, we overviewed the genre, audience, and purpose of a dissertation. In part 1, we did genre, audience, purpose of a dissertation. In part 2, we talked about how to think about the dissertation using a narrative or story structure. And in this video, we're going to talk about creating coherence between dissertation chapters. So in this part, we're going to dig into the main part of the dissertation, which is where you articulate substantive research findings and substantive research-based arguments about your dissertation topic. And we'll talk about how to create coherence and organization between the different dissertation sections. If you haven't already done so, please refer to the companion worksheet for guided exercises and opportunities for exploration as you engage with this resource. It can be very helpful for helping you think through and discover new ideas. To quickly recap from part 2, we talked about developing a narrative structure for your dissertation that is not actually that different from what we're used to in terms of other kinds of research writing, but helps us think through what the dissertation has to do as a whole. And so we talked about using the OCAR acronym, which stands for Opening, Challenge, Action, and Resolution, as a way for thinking about a narrative structure. And in this, the intro and lit review portions of your dissertation will set up an opening research context and narrow gradually towards a research problem or a key challenge. That challenge motivates the rest of the dissertation. So if you have a methodological chapter or a section where you talk about your study design or your research project, that is a kind of answer to the challenge you lay out in the introduction and lit review. And then the substantive part of the dissertation, which we'll be talking about in this video, generates understandings based on the actions you undertook in order to address the knowledge problem or that challenge. The conclusion, of course, pulls it all together and it resolves, even if it only partially resolves the challenge, and it signals what can happen next in the sequel to your dissertation. So this is another way of reviewing what I just said. So again, the intro and background chapters set up context by bringing in grounding literature. So this is the literature that is going to be relevant to your broad question, to your broad knowledge problem, and how the dissertation addresses the knowledge problem that you build from the literature. In the methods chapter, you review not just the research you conducted and how you conducted it, but also how the dissertation as a whole will address the challenge. You might also, at the end of the introduction, or perhaps if there's a second chapter in between, you might also suggest roadmaps for the dissertation for your readers, what they'll find in each ensuing part of the dissertation. The substantive chapters is what we'll talk about today, so I'll skip over that. And the conclusion chapter, again, it recaps what we now know about the knowledge problem because of your research and because of the understandings that we read about in the substantive chapters. From those sub-conclusions or sub-claims that you argue in the substantive chapter, those come together and pull together to resolve the challenge. And you also, in your conclusion chapter will signal how to apply or extend the knowledge that we now have to further understand or specify within this topic or to apply it in new directions. All right, so now we have arrived at part 3, which is creating thematic coherence between the dissertation chapters. So in this part, we are essentially asking this question: how do we make all the chapters work together to tell the same story? Another way to think of this is, how do we make each chapter sufficiently different that it can be its own chapter, while also making sure it stays in alignment with the same story as the other chapters? So that's what we'll think about today in this part of the resource. So as I mentioned in part 2, your substantive chapters, you might be drawing on a variety of sources of written or not yet written material when you think about these chapters. Lots of people will be writing what is called a staple thesis or a staple dissertation, where the idea is that you already have 3 papers that you have published either on your own or in collaboration with co-authors. And it's called a staple thesis because theoretically you can just staple those papers together and call it a dissertation. That is true to some extent. However, you will have to do some work within those papers to make sure all of the papers speak coherently together to the same knowledge problem. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But even if these are separate, distinct articles that you intend to publish in the future, or if you intend to have your dissertation set the stage for you to develop a book, and so all of the chapters are interdependent and intercoordinated, you still need to think about how each chapter works individually, solo, to make a sub-argument about the central challenge, but you also need to think about how they work together. Whether that's true whether you're writing a book dissertation or an article dissertation. You still have to make sure your substantive chapters work together because they need to be in service to the same story. The reason for that is because your reader, whether it's your implied reader or your actual reader, and again, your actual reader is your committee and your reader needs to see how the different details are connected. Otherwise, it is a disparate collection of research ideas. But by creating a framework for understanding how the details of these different projects or paper fit together, by creating that framework, you are signaling not only that you deeply understand the nuances of your research topic, but also that you can bring in the work of others and connect your work to others. And that helps you establish your professional contribution. So having coherence between these chapters is important for both the student paperness of the dissertation, showing that you have that skill and ability and the knowledge to do that. But it's also important for making the contribution. And because by pulling together different details and different kinds of projects or different aspects of the knowledge problem together under one umbrella and being able to show how they're connected, that creates a much stronger professional contribution to your research culture. So aligning chapters to be in service to the same story is difficult to do no matter what kind of dissertation type you are writing. So I'm going to use a couple of metaphors to help us understand. So as I mentioned in the previous slide, you might be writing a staple dissertation where you already have published work or almost published work that you intend to bring into your dissertation as your main chapters. But I think that considering that you still need to create coherence between those pre-existing writing projects, the metaphor that I would use to describe why that's challenging is imagine if you had to create a subway underneath a city that already exists and already is there, but doesn't have a subway. These are neighborhoods or areas that were never meant to be connected in that fashion, or at least that's not how they were designed. So you have to find a way to redesign or design a subway system that could make those neighborhoods be connected to each other. This metaphor for your dissertation is that you have papers that were written as distinct genres for distinct audiences and distinct purposes. And now you have to retrofit those papers into the dissertation and its genre requirements and its purposes. And so that's challenging to do because they weren't designed to have that coherence. So you're retroactively creating that coherence between them, and that can be challenging. If you're writing an article dissertation, and that means you have your substantive chapters that you intend to spin off into 3 or 4 distinct articles and publish those articles in the future. What you're essentially doing is creating a brand new island system in the middle of the ocean. Imagine you have to create islands that can stand by themselves as individuals and they won't float away or collapse underneath the ocean. But you also have to see how the whole system works together. You have to see the topography and the geography of the entire system together. And you have to create an ecosystem where all of the islands can live together harmoniously. So it's similar to your dissertation. that even if you intend for each chapter to stand alone eventually, for now, it's part of this larger system. And you have to be thinking about how the system works together as you write your dissertation. And finally, if you're writing a book dissertation, meaning you intend to have your dissertation be the basis for a book manuscript or a book length manuscript, this is a little bit like planning a city from scratch. You have found a piece of land and you're able to create your own city. Where do you start and where do you make sure things are connected and what do you place importance on? Writing a book is an extremely exciting but can be a very challenging endeavor because there's so much that is in your control and so much for you to decide, and that can be overwhelming. So notice that no matter what kind of dissertation you're writing, you do want to generate coherence between your chapters, and based on what you intend to do and what kind of material you intend to use in your dissertation, you'll experience this challenge even if you experience it differently compared to other peers. So your chapters will need to be able to speak to each other. You will need to have a sense of how one chapter connects to the other and the conversation that exists between them. So for this, I think I like to use another story metaphor. I like to use the metaphor of Harry Potter. So in Harry Potter, we obviously have the main character, Harry, but we also have important characters that are in story that are crucial to the story. The two that come to my mind first are Ron and Hermione. So think about Harry, Ron, and Hermione as a team. Technically, yes, I know that Harry is the main character, but imagine that they were all equal members of this team, which theoretically, and if depending on how you feel about Harry Potter, they definitely are. Each person on that team has a different role to play. Harry has his strengths, Ron has his strengths, and Hermione has her strengths. And together, those three individuals on that team are able to address all kinds of important challenges because each one of them brings something to the team. So if we extend this metaphor to your dissertation, the different chapters in your dissertation are individuals. They have their own strengths. They have their own things to say, but they come together, and in their coherence that they create together, they address a challenge or a problem that you have signaled for your reader in the introduction and literature review portions of your dissertation. So each individual chapter will, in its own way, answer the challenge or have some response for some aspect of the challenge. But the idea is that they can all add up. They can add up to become something that is the sum of themselves. And then all together, this whole section of your dissertation, the substantive section of your dissertation, will say something and create several sub-arguments that add up into a broader understanding of the knowledge problem. And it's worth investing the time to think about how a chapter connects to the other potential chapters in your dissertation by thinking about not just one chapter at a time, but all of the chapters all together. You can start to clarify what each chapter has to do, and importantly, what it doesn't have to do. You can start to see the whole story of your dissertation emerge, and from that whole story, you can tell yourself that chapter 2 only needs to make this kind of argument, chapter 3 can make another kind of argument, and chapter 4 can make a third kind of argument, and that's it. Chapter 2 doesn't have to do anything else other than that, and it will still be whole and coherent and have a contribution to the overall dissertation. So while it's important to think about the details and the specifics that will go into each chapter, that is critical, you do also want to invest some time in thinking about the chapters all together. What is the team that all of these individual chapters add up to create, and how does that help you address the challenge or the knowledge problem that you specify at the beginning of the dissertation? So here's our diagram again of the whole dissertation. And so the idea that we're going to explore now is how do we go from the research challenge that we signal at the beginning of the dissertation to these 3 distinct individual chapters that also work coherently together. So if we start from the central challenge, and this takes a while to figure out, and it is actually much more iterative than this diagram is going to make it seem. But let's assume that you have a strong sense of the knowledge problem that you're working toward or that you're working on. What you do then is disaggregate that challenge into 3 distinct ways of thinking about or addressing it. So this could be 3 different angles from which you analyze or try to understand the problem. These could be 3 different kinds of data or material that you can use to address the problem. Or if you're using the same core of data, 3 different ways to analyze or argue from the data that will give you slightly different ways of thinking about it. So think about these chapters as like a prism where there's different sides. And if you look at the challenge through one side, it will look a certain way. And if you look at it from another side, it will look a slightly different way. But all of those sides work together to hold more information about the central challenge. So after you disaggregate your challenge into 3 distinct ways of thinking about or addressing it, then you explore each of those ways in the substantive chapters of the dissertation. So each chapter addresses and generates some kind of understanding about some aspect of that challenge. It makes its own contribution. And it does that by presenting sub-arguments related to the core problem. And it supports that sub-argument with analytical material like data or interpretations of your data, findings, sections, etc. Then at the end of the dissertation, toward the conclusion or in the conclusion chapter, you pull those 3 threads back together to show how they combined speak to the challenge. So a lot of the work of coherence will happen in how you set up the 3 chapters in the beginning, how you connect one chapter to the next in the transition between the conclusion of one chapter and the introduction of the next chapter. And coherence is also created in the conclusion section, where you're not just summarizing each chapter, you are actually helping the chapters speak to each other, and you're telling your reader how they all add up, how they all work together to create a broader meta argument about the central challenge or the knowledge problem. Okay, so how do you actually do this? How do you go from a knowledge problem to these 3 different pillars or these 3 different areas for thinking about it? I like to think that you can do this either inductively or deductively. And in reality, it's going to be a combination of both. You are going to go back and forth between your understanding of the knowledge problem that you are generating and the chapters that you can actually write based on the material that you have, whether that's data or other analytical material. It is a very iterative process. You will hone the knowledge problem that you promise to your reader based on what you know you are delivering in your substantive chapters, and vice versa. You will hone your substantive chapters based on what you know you've promised to your reader as the knowledge problem in the beginning. So these things actually work together iteratively. But if you're just getting started and you're not sure how the chapters will work together with the knowledge problem, you can try to think about it inductively or deductively. So let's start with inductive. So imagine you want to create 3 different chapters. There's several ways you could do this. If you have a multi-method study where you have lots of different kinds of data, or if you have different kinds of material, especially if you've done comparative work, you might think about structuring the chapters to focus on one type of data or one kind of material at a time. So you can think about it that way. Another way you could think about it, and this would be true if you're using multi-method data or multi-method study with multiple data, or if you're using the same data. So if you have, for example, if you've engaged in qualitative research and you have a lot of interviews, that is something that is one big rich source of data. So you don't need different data, but you can argue one trend, result, or finding in each chapter. And you can break that finding up into sub-findings for each chapter. So you can draw on the same data, but just highlight different elements or findings from that core of data. Alternatively, you can do something more integrative, where even if you have multiple sources of data, you have a broader trend or a broader argument supported with data, perhaps from multiple forms or material from multiple places. Then from that main trend, you could expand on that trend, or you can get even more specific with it. In the third chapter, you might explore a new trend, or you might further explore the original trend that you first introduced in the first data chapter. And again, you can use the same data or bring in additional data. For what it's worth, my dissertation looked more like this, the bottom here. I introduced an idea in the first chapter about how veteran-focused charities came to be, and not necessarily why, but showed that they were coming to be, and it was creating ideas for how they should do their work. And then in the second chapter, I explored how that worked on an organizational level. So I used other kinds of material and data to explore that same idea even further. And then in my third chapter, I introduced a new idea about gender. And that's how I built my chapters together. So as you can see, there's lots of ways that you can create coherence that have nothing to do with having different sources of data or having the same kind of data. Whether you have a lot of data, a lot of different kinds of data, or the same overall kind of data, there's ways that you can pull together the coherence between the chapters inductively. After you think through what you might do for each of these individual pillars, then you can think about how they pull together. So you would zoom out and think to yourself, what kind of broader knowledge problem can fit all of these three, or all three of these ideas? So if you sketch this out one pillar at a time, think about the overarching category or umbrella that would be big enough to hold all of them. And that can help you think about what your central knowledge problem is. So this is a kind of inductive approach where you're starting from your substantive chapters and you're thinking about building a knowledge problem from what you have in your chapters. Alternatively, you could also do this deductively, where you know for sure what your knowledge problem is. It's very clear what your knowledge problem is. And then you break that up into three different opportunities or three different ways to think about it. And then again, you bring in the data, the finding, or the trend that you want to talk about in each particular pillar. And again, you're making sub-arguments in each pillar and supporting that sub-argument with data or material from your research. Okay, so at this point, I would encourage you to pause and go to the companion worksheet and explore how you might create these create this coherence both inductively and deductively. In the first exercise, think about a central challenge or knowledge problem that your dissertation could address, and explore how that challenge could be disaggregated deductively. In the second, you can think about three potential chapters that you could theoretically write about and write on. And then you can zoom up and think about how they might combine inductively. What kind of umbrella could hold them all together? So go ahead and take a moment to use the worksheet. When you're ready, come back and we'll continue with this video. Okay, welcome back. I hope you found the inductive versus deductive exercises in the companion worksheet helpful. To recap where we've been so far, all of the substantive chapters in your dissertation need to be in service to the same story, so they all fit within that narrative structure. That story is motivated by a central challenge or a central knowledge problem. I use those two terms interchangeably. Each chapter on its own will facilitate some understanding about some aspect of that knowledge problem. In addition, the chapters all add up into a broader understanding of the problem. That adding up is signaled in the introduction based on how you frame the project, frame the chapters. It's also signaled in the transition between chapters. So in the conclusion section from one chapter and the intro to the next chapter. So in that space in between each chapter. And that adding up is also signaled in the concluding chapter of your dissertation, where you're tying all those threads back together again. You can determine the relationship between the chapters that you're writing and the knowledge problem that you're trying to address inductively or deductively, but as I mentioned, it will likely be both of those. You'll go back and forth between the chapters you're trying to write and the knowledge problem you're trying to argue about. So at this point, I'm going to introduce a new idea for helping create coherence, and that is themes. So up to this point, we've talked a lot about the central challenge or the knowledge problem, and that is key. Defining a knowledge problem is key for motivating your reader to continue reading on with the dissertation and to understand the value and the contribution that your dissertation makes. The central challenge or the knowledge problem that you are arguing exists is something that is more empirical. It's something that we could know or that we could know better, but we don't know. So if we did research, we would find the answer to this empirical puzzle. So to talk about a knowledge problem means invoking that there are dynamic specifics to that particular exploration. So whether you're working on how drug delivery works in particular organs, or if you're working on how the Bronte sisters negotiated power dynamics in their prose, or if you're working on, like me, the emergence of veteran-focused charities, there are dynamic specifics to each of those questions, and those specifics are informing the knowledge problem. They are informing the challenge that we would argue exists. And so the reader who reads the dissertation about any of those topics will learn about that empirical challenge. They'll learn about the drug delivery, they'll learn about the Bronte sisters, they'll learn about the veteran-focused charities. And so the dissertation will teach the reader about that empirical challenge. But another thing that the dissertation does, and another aspect for creating coherence, is through themes. So whereas the central knowledge problem is something empirical, themes are more theoretical. They're big questions that drive this and the work like this. So if you think about what your dissertation is, you have probably an empirical puzzle that you're trying to figure out, but you also have bigger questions that are driving your interest in that empirical puzzle. For me, as someone who studied veteran charities, I was always interested in how the military and civilian society interacted and how we constructed veterans as social identities in our culture. And so that was a broad theoretical question that I was interested in that led me to the empirical puzzle of my particular dissertation. So whereas the challenge or knowledge problem is about the dynamic specifics of the question, themes are overarching thought frameworks. They're ways of thinking about the knowledge problem. They're ways of thinking about what is driving this empirical situation or this empirical phenomenon. And there are theoretical ways of understanding what's at work here. Whereas the dissertation will teach the reader about a particular empirical challenge, it will also teach the reader how to think about that challenge. And that's where themes come in. So again, we're sort of complicating the idea of what the dissertation does. It not only resolves some knowledge problem that is about the specific dynamic ideas or details about a particular empirical phenomenon. The dissertation is also providing the analytical tools and the theoretical tools for the reader to know how to think about the empirical challenge. So through themes, the reader would be able to understand how to think about the complication of drug delivery in different organs, or how to think about how authors like the Bronte sisters navigated power dynamics, or how to think about how the military and civilian society interact in these veteran-focused charities. So it provides not just information about the specific empirical idea or the specific empirical problem, but also a broader thought framework for how to conceptualize and understand that problem. And that's where themes come in. So themes are not only useful for building logical coherence between your chapters, they are also the thing that generates your theoretical contribution. So your dissertation will make a contribution by virtue of the fact that it explores something empirically that hasn't been explored in this way before. And that's good. That's an important contribution. But you can also generate a theoretical contribution with your dissertation by thinking about the broader theoretical themes that can drive how we understand or how we can think about the empirical phenomenon that you're studying. So themes are big questions that your discipline or the subfield that you're in within your discipline is uniquely suited to answer. We have lots of different disciplines in the academic world, and they're all slightly different and they all have different strengths. And so themes in your dissertation are a way to hone in on the questions and the ideas that your discipline or your subfield is uniquely poised to address and to talk about. By thinking about this and by thinking about the themes that your dissertation can speak to and the themes that your dissertation can integrate from your discipline, you're also going to be achieving something important in the dissertation, which is showing your committee that you can be a steward of the discipline, that you can integrate the thought frameworks of the discipline into your own thinking, and you can use them for interesting or novel research projects. And that's an important part of the purpose of the dissertation. You know that there is a theme, or that you can think about a theme for your dissertation when there's a substantial body of scholarship that you can use for grounding literature. So if you think about the empirical question that you have, there may or may not be a lot of literature on that specific question, on that specific empirical topic. But there are probably other kinds of literature that explore similar topics or more sort of like theoretical understanding of how that topic functions in the world. And that can be something that is more thematic. Themes will help you determine how to present your challenge or how to present your knowledge problem. Based on how you frame or present the knowledge problem as a theoretical question mark or as a theoretical question for your discipline, that will then inform what's important for addressing that challenge. And then that sets the stage for what each chapter has to do for addressing the challenge in a thematic way. So, for example, my dissertation on veteran-focused charities in the United States, I integrated three main big questions that I use different kinds of scholarship, different kinds of literatures as grounding scholarship. So my dissertation ultimately thematically asked, what's the relationship between the military, the state, and nonprofit organizations? Why do new nonprofit organizations act in the way that they do? And how do people within organizational context construct realities for themselves? And I pulled on foundational theory and foundational grounding literature in the form of civil military relations literature, nonprofit organizational theory, new institutional theory, and inhabited institutions theory. And those theories also help generate coherence between my chapters. In chapters 2 and 4, I pulled on both of those theories together. I also pulled on new institutional theory in chapter 2 and was able to connect that to nonprofit theory in chapter 3, and then pulled that together again in chapters 3 and 4. And so even though each chapter focused on slightly different empirical phenomena related to my case about veteran-focused charities, they also made arguments and connected veteran-focused charities to these theories in this different way. So I'm going to keep thinking or talking a little bit more about themes and using the structure diagram again. We will skip over the answering the challenge part of this because again, now we're just thinking about themes. So in the introduction of your dissertation, you'll create a research space for your empirical challenge. We've already talked about this. You'll set up some context, narrow that context toward a knowledge problem. But in your introduction, you should also suggest the theoretical themes or the areas of theory and existing scholarship that can be used to understand the nature of the challenge. So you're not just signaling that the challenge exists, you're also giving your reader a theoretical toolkit for how they can understand what the problem is all about, what it's ultimately all about. And so how the reader can understand the nature of the challenge. In the dissertation introduction, you will preview those themes, the data, and the argument of the ensuing chapters. This is sometimes called a roadmap. Not all departments or advisors will require or even recommend a roadmap. So to the extent that you preview the theme, data, and arguments of ensuing chapters might be something that you negotiate with your advisor. And then as you go forward into each substantive chapter, again, each chapter makes a sub-argument about the empirical challenge and supports it with evidence, but each chapter will also draw upon theoretical themes in the framing of that argument and in how the chapter talks about the implications. So you'll not only set up the argument using the theory, you'll also resolve that sub-argument and talk about the implications of that sub-argument using the theoretical themes that you talk about in the beginning. And in this, you're not only uncovering an aspect of the empirical challenge, you're also uncovering for your reader an aspect of how they can think about that challenge or how they can think about that aspect of the empirical challenge. And finally, as you move to the conclusion of your dissertation, this will bring all of the conclusions for the substantive chapters together into a broader argument about what's happening with this empirical challenge. The conclusion can also revisit those theoretical themes and spell out how the dissertation advances our understanding in these theoretical areas. So here's where you might make direct calls to scholars in other fields or scholars in the theoretical fields that you are drawing upon. And you might make claims about what scholars in those fields can learn or what they might use from this research or from this dissertation. And why it's important to include this in the conclusion is that you have not only left your reader with empirical closure, i.e., they feel like the knowledge problem has been resolved. It also leaves them with thematic closure. They know how to think about this empirical challenge. They have a thought framework for understanding this challenge as they go forward in their life and engage with other research. And so both kinds of closure, both the resolution of the empirical challenge as well as thematic closure, are important for leaving your reader feeling satisfied at the end of the dissertation. What's important to remember is that writing involves a lot of discovery. And I think sometimes we get stuck because we think we need to know what the dissertation is going to be about before we start writing it. Or we think we need to know what the themes are or what the chapters will be about before we start working on them, because otherwise we worry that we might be wasting our time. But the truth is you'll discover what your chapters can be, how they can speak to each other, and the themes that will unite them through writing the dissertation, not before. And it's not a wasted time. By sitting with your writing and engaging in the process, even when you're not sure where the road is going to lead, you actually will create stronger, more coherent, and more dynamic and interesting writing products. So don't wait to start writing until you figure out what your dissertation is all about or what it's going to be about. You need writing in order to figure out what your dissertation is all about. So sit with it. And you can start that right now. So in part 3C of the companion worksheet, there are exploratory exercises to help you start thinking about the themes and the questions that you could use to unite the chapters. The exercises are a little unconventional. They're not necessarily straightforward questions. So for example, one of the exercises will have you write a dialogue between your chapters where you'll give each idea a name and then you literally write a conversation between the chapters with those names. And so that's a rather unconventional exercise, but it's productive because it helps you think about how your chapters would literally speak to each other. So as you're engaging with the exercises in the companion worksheet, you might feel a little uncomfortable, you might be a little bored, you might start feeling like, I don't know what I'm doing, help me. Remember that it's okay to sit with that discomfort. In fact, the discomfort is proof that you are figuring out something that is very complex. If it was easy to do this, you wouldn't feel that discomfort. So that discomfort is proof that you're doing something challenging and you have all the tools that you need to do it. Just sit with the discomfort, go toward the discomfort, and let it inform you and let it pass. So this is the end of part 3. At this point, please do refer to the companion worksheet and spend some time thinking about your chapters and how you might build thematic coherence between those chapters. And when you're ready, you can move on to the final part of this resource, part 4.